thank you, first of all, for inviting me to be here and share again with you the science that I do. I'm one of the very few people in the world who actually builds these climate data sets from scratch. Most people talk about them. I'm the technical guy that actually puts these things together. The question is, does science validate the Clean Power Plan? And I can say no and sit down and we'll be done with that. But the real tragedy of that question is that the science does not, and yet that's the foundation for which these regulations are being promoted. And so we have a foundationless regulatory system that is being imposed on us even as we speak. Now, in 2006, President Bush said, America is addicted to oil. And I don't think he was right. We're not addicted to oil. We are addicted to these things. We're addicted to long life, good health, progress, affordable services, freedom of mobility, food, natural landscapes, and so on. These are the things we are addicted to, and they come because we have affordable energy, electrification, transportation, and industry, and those are roughly one-third, one-third, one-third in terms of the amount of energy we produce. That energy comes from carbon, and most of it, 87%, nuclear and hydroelectric power a little bit. I didn't put the renewables up there because they really don't matter in the grand scheme of things in terms of power production today. Now, because carbon is burned to get the energy, we need to know something about that carbon dioxide that's released. And so that last box there, carbon dioxide is non-toxic. It invigorates the biosphere. We measure that from satellites, that the world is greener now than it was 100 years ago, or at least when the satellite era began in the 70s. Because of the extra CO2, plants love the stuff. CO2 used to be 5 to 10 times the concentration it is now in the atmosphere. It also increases food production. Did you know that about 1/6 of our plant food production for human consumption is due just to the extra CO2 we put back in the atmosphere? Think about that as a benefit. 1 out of every 6 oranges, comes from the extra CO2 we put back in the atmosphere. Well, I'm a scientist. All science is numbers, as Lord Kelvin said, so you're going to see numbers here. I'm not just going to give you some emotional appeal about something. I'm going to show you numbers, some facts. But first of all, you need to know something about the scientific method. And one thing about the scientific method is that a fundamental aspect of it is that when you understand a system, you are able to predict its behavior. That's fundamental to science. When you understand it, you can predict it. Well, let's just look back at last winter, not this previous one, but 2 winters ago. That was a prediction from the best ability of our government scientists to tell us what's going to happen for the winter. The winter was supposed to be extremely warm, coast to coast, and that was our latest and greatest science. What actually happened was this. It was one of the coldest winters ever. It was not a bad forecast. It was a wrong forecast. Had you bet on the forecast, you would have been wrong with your assets of whatever you would have put into it. So this tells us for a 3-month forecast, we do not know how to do it. Our level of ignorance on the climate system is really enormous, and it shows up here. So scientifically, we have failed in even presenting a 3-month forecast. So how do you deal with this, as it's called, settled science of the administration's view of climate change? Well, they think they understand the system so well they can predict its behavior, so let's look at some of the predictions being made. And so remember that a climate model simulation, that's telling us how the world is supposed to work in the future and how the temperature might change, that's a claim. That's a climate model result. It's only a claim, a hypothesis. How do you present a falsifiable test? How can we look at this climate model output and see if it really is telling us the truth? Well, you select a prominent metric that demonstrates the greenhouse effect. You look at the climate system. How is the climate system supposed to change if you add extra greenhouse gases, if you add CO2? So one test is, let's just compare global temperatures. What does the model say? What did the atmosphere actually do? Well, let's go back. This is a history lesson now. Let's go back to 1988 when this whole thing really started. And Jim Hansen, a NASA scientist, was presenting information to the Senate committee, and this was his chart. He said, if we don't do anything to stop CO2 emissions, that red and orange line is going to result in terms of global temperature. The temperature is just going to rise, and we are going to be in terrible straits. if we cut all CO2 emissions in the year 2000, remember this is 1988, in 2000, we can level off the temperature at that yellow line. That's a hypothesis. That's a claim that a scientist has made based upon his model. We produce real data of the real world. That's what actually happened with the global temperature since 1988. It didn't go hardly anywhere. The temperature has not been rising anywhere near what the model projections, the theory had said. But that's 1988. What about, this is 2015. Certainly we know something more that science has advanced since that time. And so we're going to go now and look at a metric of the climate system that the greenhouse gases in the models really hit. In other words, this is the place you go if you want to see the greenhouse effect. That bottom chart is a cross-section of the atmosphere. The surface is the ground at the bottom. The stratosphere is way at the top. It's about 60,000 feet or so in the atmosphere for that picture. South pole is to the left, North pole is to the right, so it's a cross-section from pole to pole. The tropics are in the middle, and when you look at climate model output, this is the key point of this picture. In the tropical atmosphere, the temperature should be rising dramatically. By now, we should be able to look at the tropical atmosphere and say, well, the temperature there has just risen tremendously, and we should be able to detect it. That layer, 10 to 50,000 feet, is actually the layer of one of the products we produce that we generate from satellite temperatures. This is how the models did. These are the latest and greatest models. They show that the Earth should have warmed dramatically, or the tropics should have warmed dramatically during that time. The squares and the circles are balloons and satellites. Two independent measurements of that area of the atmosphere. They show hardly anything has happened. That tells you that the theory is not right. In science, when we understand a system, as it says at the bottom left, we can predict its behavior. This picture says we can't predict its behavior. We do not understand the science of climate. Do it this way. In Alabama, they love this picture, so I'm sure in West Virginia it will be the same. By the way, in Alabama, we export electricity, as was mentioned earlier, a lot, over 60 million megawatt hours a year. That happens to be the same amount that California imports every year. I mean, it's almost against the law to make electricity in California. But even though the grid doesn't work this way, we like to think that California can keep its iPads charged and everything because we in Alabama push electrons from coal and nuclear power. Okay, so this is the target. Think of this as a target you are shooting at. And that's the global temperature increase, or the tropical temperature increase since 1979. Not very much. I'm giving you 102 bullets for your gun. And you're going to take aim at this target and shoot 102 times. This is what hundreds of millions of dollars of climate modeling research has produced for us. 102 shots. Every single one missed, every single one way too high. And would you want to go into battle with a weapon system that produced this result with the claim, well, on the 103rd shot we'll hit the target? No. This tells us we do not understand the system. The evidence on which these clean power bills are based is right there in front of you that says this is not evidence that is supported by science. Got a call one night from a Senate staffer, Senator Jeff Sessions, who's very much on this issue. He said, I need a chart. And he says, it needs to be real simple, Dr. Christy, because I'm presenting it to senators, okay? So, I mean, I'm working late. I'm trying to update this chart. I worked all through Monday night, and this is what you don't see here is, downloading 102 climate models, putting them together, get the numbers and all the observations too. So it just took me forever to do this, but I finally got one that he liked, that the staffer liked, and I sent it up there. Next day, it's up there on the Senate, and he's showing it in front to show the world, again, from this picture, the evidence on which these bills, these regulations are based, are not lining up with reality. They will not express what is really happening in the climate system. Now, remember that chart from 1988? That's how good science was back then. That's where we are now. I don't see any improvement in 25 years after hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent on a climate modeling industry. And I mean it is an industry, because these people now have lobbyists. They want more money to keep their models running and create dramatic pictures that don't match reality. So the evidence clearly demonstrates that there is a fundamental problem with the current understanding of the climate system. All models fail in the same direction. The current models fail significantly, and that's a scientific term. It means they have been falsified as tools that can tell us what is happening in the world. Now, when I'm in Congress, I say it this way: if the models can't tell us what has happened, how can they tell us why it happened? In other words, CO2 emissions are not the source of what's happening. They should not, the model should not be used for policy. Well, then we hear these stories about, let's look at other evidence besides temperature. Okay, the models fail there. Well, maybe they're right somewhere else. Snow is supposed to be going away. This is the Northern Hemisphere snow cover for the last 50 years. And what you see there is the greatest amount of snow cover that has occurred in this record actually occurred in the year 2012 to 13. Snow is not going away. You know that. We had a big snowfall season in Alabama this past year. Snow is not going away. Sea ice. This is the ice that floats on the sea that forms in the wintertime at each pole. In the Arctic, it is going down. In the Antarctic, it's going up. No climate model predicted the sea ice in the South Pole would go up. In fact, when you add them together, and this is the latest chart I just got yesterday, that the global sea ice is exactly on the average of the last 40 years. It is not going away. We still have as much sea ice as we've had globally. What about extreme weather? This is always, whenever an extreme weather event happens, you know, somehow it's our fault. As if extreme weather has never happened before, as if we've never had a hurricane before, as if we've never had a drought before. This is just, for a climatologist who builds records for the long history, this is just an incredibly naive view of the world. Well, how about hurricanes? Science is numbers. We count hurricanes. The number and intensity of hurricanes has not increased at all in the last 45 years. What about tornadoes? The number and intensity of tornadoes has not increased since the records began back in the 1950s, I think is what that shows. I can't really see it. In fact, we've had some of the quietest years ever in the last 2 years. Droughts and floods. The floods are on the blue, droughts are on the red. Since 1895, they have not gone up or down. They happen, they are severe at times, but they have not gone up or down. Droughts and floods still happen, as they always happen, but they're not changing. How about global drought? This is a satellite-based measurement. Global drought is actually declining a little bit. That is not the story that you have been told from essentially the media, as it tries to promote sensationalism and really helps spread an agenda that is not based on numbers. How about hot days? This is a fraction of hot days, of 100-degree days throughout the United States. And as you can see, we've had some very cool summers. These past few years, the 30s were just incredible in terms of the number of days that hit 100 degrees. Well, so views of dangerous climate change rely on models that fail simple testing and are not based on the evidence we have. Now, climate change is a political issue. That's not anything new to you all. So I am asked often to testify before Congress, and I think one of the reasons I keep getting invited back is because the evidence, I'm one of the people that actually builds the evidence that can demonstrate and explain how these things come about. As it said, it was a political issue. And about a year and a half ago, the administration really put into high gear an effort to really denigrate those who have a different view than what the administration has. And so one of the leaders of this is the Secretary of State, Kerry, and he launches with many speeches, and in this particular one, back in February of 2014, called anyone that did not agree with the administration members of the Flat Earth Society. Members of the Flat Earth Society, and that climate change was the worst kind of thing that could ever happen. Well, a colleague, Dick McNider, and I at our University of Alabama in Huntsville, we don't play football. That's down in Tuscaloosa. We play ice hockey. We came back and hit him with the fact Kerry is flat wrong on climate change, because wasn't it the scientist who looked at evidence and observations who determined the world was round so many years ago, and not the one who believed it was flat? It was the scientist looking at the evidence back in the Greek times. And this was the first time I put together this chart where it shows the administration's view of climate is the red line based upon models. The satellite and balloon, the real evidence of climate, is shown here as the green and blue lines, that there is a real disconnect between what the administration believes is happening in the world and what is actually happening. Well, this gets you all kinds of attention. I've been in a lot of places, appeared and so on, but having the New York Times come down and do a profile on you is a pretty big deal. And what was even more impressive was that it was a positive profile. So this was the New York Times, by the way. I love the subtitle of this, or the title of the article. It says, "Though scorned by colleagues, a climate change skeptic is unbowed." Why I like that title so much is because what do you bow to? You bow to dogma, you bow to authorities, you bow to those kinds of things. Whereas someone like me, and I'm looking through my data from 50 years ago that I took in California when I was just a kid, I loved climate way back then even, is that I let the numbers tell me what's going on with the world. I let the observations tell me what is happening with the world. And I've shown you many of those already. Well, that does not escape the administration's attention, and so they launched an investigation of 7 of us who appeared before Congress through the years. Because we had a view different from theirs, there must be something in our background. There must be some way we are being paid under the table. And so this investigation was launched to try to find out how we are somehow sullied by money coming in under the table or anything else. And when the reporter of this particular article, this is a congressional investigation, when the reporter asked the staffer about, why are you looking at Dr. Christy? Up here in the right-hand corner, he gave the answer. Well, he's testified in Congress. He seems to have the most impact on the scientific community. He has published widely, and he's been profiled in the New York Times. Now, if you were a professor at a university and you had that on your resume, you would be a star. But in this world and with this administration, you're an enemy. And it's just sad that someone, who's actually lived in another country like me, who's come back and loves this country so much, that my own government, thinks I'm an enemy of this government for producing real facts about the climate system. But that's the world we live in now. Oh, by the way, he did add at the end, the committee has found no smoking gun on Christy. Because I've never taken money from industry or anything. All my funding is federal and state grants. And they can't understand that. How can you have your view and not be paid to have it? Well, where regulations make a difference. I showed this picture, too, at the hearing about 3 weeks ago up in Washington. This is pretty remarkable. I said, let's suppose that on May 13th, 2015, the United States disappeared from the earth. No people, no industry, no cars, no emissions. What would the global climate do, even if you believed global climate models? If you believed global climate models and we were all poof, gone. The evidence showed that even using models, that the change in global temperature would be so tiny we really couldn't measure it in 50 years. That's the impact if the whole country goes away. What do you think the impact is if we're trying to fiddle with coal-fired power plants? Minuscule. I can't even put it on the chart. It's so tiny. So the scientific method shows, I'm talking about numbers here, reproducible numbers. These have been, similar numbers have presented in federal court. I've been cross-examined for hours and hours. They stand in federal court. Regulations that impose higher energy costs will do nothing perceptible or attributable to whatever the climate is going to do. Now, the real world happens. And sometimes that's just a wonderful thing. The real world happens. I was a science, physics and chemistry teacher in Africa, and I just had a terrific time and just loved the people there. But I also learned about the energy system of East Africa, that the energy source of biomass, it's a bad idea, folks. It's a bad idea. The energy transmission was the backs of women. I saw them get up in the morning. They would walk, the UN estimates an average of 3.1 miles to the nearest forest edge, chop down about 50 pounds of wood, put it on their back, haul it home. That was their energy transmission system. And the energy use, and this is the sad part, is that it's burned in the homes there, the huts, and you can see the smoke, and you can imagine the aerosols and the respiratory problems that will cause. The UN estimates about 3 million children die every year from this energy system, of breathing these aerosols and byproducts of biomass in the homes. That's 3 million children today per year die from this energy system. African parents don't like to see their children die. They're just like you and I've been there when it's happened. They grieve inconsolably, just like you and I would. They're going to move away from that system, and they're going to go to the systems you and I use. And if you see in the bottom left corner there, I say to value human life means avoiding this energy system, getting away from that energy system. Well, what's going on in the world in CO2 emissions? They're catching on, right? China and India, their emissions are just rising because that energy system is so much better than the other. All of these regulations that you guys are, and we in Alabama, we are just like you. We are in a desperate fight with the EPA to try to salvage and save what we produce in our state. What these regulations are doing are trying to bend that green line down just a little bit. All these will do will try to bend that green line down a little. But look at what's happening with just two countries, China and India. That's the story. We are spitting in the ocean with these kinds of regulations. Because that energy system is a whole lot better than this energy system because people live longer and better lives. The real world happens. What's happening in Germany? They're building 26 coal-fired power plants. Their energy system of the wind and solar just wouldn't cut it. The average residential rate went to 38 cents a kilowatt hour. They are uncompetitive in the world. They have to do something. They're building coal-fired power plants. As Jeff said, their emissions are rising. Green, green Germany. Their emissions are rising. Japan. Japan announced in April they're building 43 coal-fired power plants. Green, green Japan. Their CO2 emissions are rising. Coal use, look at the upper chart. The coal use is rising like crazy. I mean, you just can't beat having a nice life. People want to have it. They don't like to have a hard life. And that's going to move everything in that direction. No one's following the United States example on this. We are just an outlier in the world, and we are, almost shooting ourselves in the foot because we are trying to make our energy more expensive, therefore our economy less competitive. And finally, this is a moral issue. Now, so far I've talked about scientific things, and we measure things in science. We say, it's this hot, this cold, this many tornadoes and so on. We count. Science is numbers. When it comes down to the moral issue, I can't take a person and put them in the laboratory and calculate their value. That's something you just have to know. You just have to believe. Does human life have value? And I suspect all of us here would say, well, yeah, I think it has a lot of value. We would give anything for it. We would give everything for it. That's how much value human life has. Even if it was only half of everything, that's still a lot. Okay, so let's establish that as a data point, that human life has a tremendous amount of value. When you look at all these things we're addicted to, it all leads to the fact we value human life. It makes life longer and better for all of us. And if you do that, now we're back to science. If human life has value, then what you want to do is move people up on that curve, because you will live longer if you use more energy. Energy comes from carbon today. Most of it comes from carbon. So if you are moral in your view of the world, you will say, we need to have more energy used around the world, supplied to people who can afford it, and therefore lift themselves out of the poverty and the terrible situations in which they find themselves. Here's another problem. I don't pay much for my energy as a proportion of my salary. I'm the guy in the left column. I do pretty well. But what about the poorest people in Alabama? And in Alabama, like West Virginia, we have a lot of very poor people. The proportion of their income they pay for energy is huge, almost 30% on average for this category. When you raise energy prices, you are going to hurt the poorest among us. Not me so much, but the poorest among us. Helping the poor means lowering energy costs. And think about that. If you want to help poor people, the quickest way, lower energy costs. Whether it's their electric bill they have to pay each month, their gasoline costs, or whatever. That's the quickest way. And of course, every other product that they buy is related to energy, and everything comes down. Hurting the poor means increasing energy costs. That's the fastest way to hurt folks. Well, I have a law of sustainability I'll get to on the next slide. What's CO2 cuts? That's more for developed countries, and this is the Indian environmental prime minister, by the way, from India. The moral principle of historic responsibility cannot be washed away. India's first task is eradication of poverty. 20% of our population doesn't have access to electricity, and that is our top priority. We will grow faster, and our CO2 emissions will rise. Germany, Japan, India, China, they're all rising. And guess what's powering most of that? It's coal. Now, here's my law of sustainability. If it's not economically sustainable, it's not sustainable. Lifting people out of energy poverty with carbon is morally right and is going to keep happening everywhere else no matter what the U.S. does. So, in summary, what do the numbers show? The scientific method demonstrates the current theory of CO2 warming of the climate is out of step with reality. The extreme weather events we care about are not increasing in frequency or intensity. Punitive regulatory controls will do essentially nothing to change whatever the climate's going to do. CO2 emitting coal is increasingly powering the world's economies, including Germany's and Japan's, along with developing countries, no matter what the U.S. says. And what does my experience tell me about this? Climate change is a political issue, and there is a cost for those of us who are not politically correct. There is a cost for people like me. If there is a value in enhancing the quality and length of human life, the moral imperative is to expand access to low-cost carbon-based energy, and this is happening anyway. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, if you have a couple of questions, I'd be happy to answer them or try to.
What kind of reception do you get from Congress, from the reasonable people in Congress?
Okay. Well, we can take out the reasonable, okay? Let's just say from Congress, the majority agree with that. I can tell you this, the majority of our congressmen and senators agree with the presentation I've just given. They can't get to 2/3, though. It takes 2/3 to override a veto, and that's why we're stuck.
In the past week or so, there's been a story in the media reporting that a new study has altered the established idea, I thought, that we have 17 years of flat temperatures. What have they done with respect to the data to produce that include actually we haven't had 17 years of flat temperatures and instead we've had increase?
Okay, I'm familiar with that. In fact, I was in California last week on the road answering, you might have seen me in the New York Times or Washington Post or something answering that kind of question. To make it simple, this group applied a new type of adjustment to the data, and that's what made the increase. It was an adjustment to the data that they applied that none of us would have applied. However, this was surface temperature data. They did something to buoys and ships and so on. We use satellite data that isn't subject to the issues they are talking about there. And all the satellite data sets, we don't produce the only one. All the balloon data sets show virtually no warming in the last 18 years. I go with those. That's the bulk atmospheric measurement. I think there's something fishy about what they did with that one surface temperature data set. The other surface temperature data sets are pretty much showing no real warming either.
Other questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I'm a recent law school graduate, and I've had an emphasis in energy policy. You know, I'm fascinated by the climate change, global warming, whatever term they're using now. And all the money's being done into this, and what's happening. I'm from Appalachia. I was born, raised, educated, all retired, and died here in Appalachia. So obviously, I don't want to hurt my area, see it hurt me anyway. But the question I have is why are they not reaching for the lower hanging fruit? Say the recycling. If the United States would up the recycling by 5%, it would be like closing 65 coal mining power plants. To me, that's a much more feasible goal than going after the coal industry the way that they have with the current policy. So my question is, why not reach for the lower
Yeah, well, let me broaden it a bit. There are some environmental problems that are serious. Why don't we go after those? Why don't we take care of water in Africa? You want to save 50 million people a year? Clean up the water in Africa. 50 million lives, is that worth something? The donors who contribute to environmental advocacy groups that drive this whole issue and really have part of the Democratic Party kind of confined to agree to, can't make money that way. But for some reason, the global warming issue attracts the fancy and the dollars from the rich, environmentally leaning people in our country. And I think that's the motivation that this is going down right now. If they were concerned about lives, they wouldn't be dealing with global warming. They'd be dealing with things they could really fix. And that's the unfortunate thing.